Let's dive straight into the fascinating world of Philostratus and his attempt to write the history of the Sophists. This isn't just a dry list, it's a foundational text that shaped how we think about these figures. So, who is this Philostratus? Think of him as a literary figure in the Roman Empire, writing around 230 CE. He's crafting this hefty work, The Lives of the Sophists, specifically for Gordian I, who would later become emperor. Now, Gordian wasn't just any aristocrat. He was linked to Herodes Atticus, one of the most famous sophists of the later period. This connection is crucial. Philostratus himself was a sophist, so he's writing about his own kind, tracing their lineage back to classical Athens. What makes this text so pivotal? It's generally considered the first major post-classical effort to define and describe a distinct era of sophistic activity. Before this, the Sophists were more like scattered stars. Philostratus tried to connect them into a constellation, and that idea stuck. Okay, what exactly did Philostratus mean by this first sophistic? He saw it not just as a collection of individuals, but as a continuous tradition, a craft passed down through generations. He even talks about its sequel, the second sophistic, which dominated his own time. But focusing on the first sophistic, what are its defining features according to him? Forget the philosophical debates that often dominate our view today. For Philostratus, this was fundamentally an oratorical tradition. He calls it philosophizing oratory, which sounds fancy, but think of it as rhetoric that aimed for a higher purpose, maybe even touching on wisdom. Crucially, he highlights skills that were valued in his own day, the ability to speak brilliantly off the cuff, and using that skill to serve the state. And get this, he invents personal rivalries and relationships between these ancient figures, adding a human drama dimension that's completely absent from other sources. It's like he's giving them back their social network. So, who are the stars of this show? Philostratus gives us a list of 9 key figures. You'll recognize most of them: Gorgias, Protagoras, Hippias, Prodicus, Thrasymachus, Antiphon, Critias, and Isocrates. These are the guys Plato and Xenophon love to put in the hot seat against Socrates. They form the core of almost any modern list you'll find. There are 2 exceptions, Polus and Isocrates. Polus is a bit of an outlier, sometimes excluded from the main group, while Isocrates, though a major figure, sometimes gets left out of the tightest definitions of the Sophists. But for Philostratus, they're all in the first sophistic club. Notice how this list aligns so closely with the figures Plato famously portrayed as intellectual opponents. That tension is central to understanding Philostratus' project. Now, why does this matter? Because Philostratus' version became the blueprint. Right after he wrote it, people were citing it. Eunapius, centuries later, basically continued his project. Through the Byzantine era, references kept popping up, but its biggest impact might be on us. Fast forward to the early 20th century, Hermann Diels, the guy who compiled the fragments of the Presocratics, looked to Philostratus when he first defined the older sophistic. His initial list, based on Philostratus, included 8 named individuals. It's almost identical, except it leaves out Polus and Isocrates and adds Xeniades instead. That Diels-Kranz list, refined over time, became the bedrock for how modern scholars like Guthrie, Kerferd, and Bonazzi have understood the Sophists. So, Philostratus didn't just write a history, he wrote the syllabus for the next 2,000 years of sophistic studies. Okay, so was Philostratus totally original? Did nobody think about the Sophists as a group before him? Well, there are whispers. Plato, in dialogues like Protagoras, definitely portrays them as a community of competing intellectuals. In the Hippias Major, he even lists the 4 big names, Gorgias, Protagoras, Prodicus, Hippias, as international rock stars of their time. Aristotle defines sophistry as seeming wisdom, not real wisdom. Interestingly, a later commentator, pointing readers towards Plato's dialogues, uses these very names, Hippiases, Protagorases, Gorgiases, Prodicuses, suggesting they were known as a group whose wisdom generated wealth. So the ingredients were there, the term, the key figures, even hints of a shared identity. But what's missing is a clear narrative of a unified movement or a defined historical era. That's the gap Philostratus fills. Let's look at Philostratus's contemporaries. 3 other writers of his time, Diogenes Laertius, Athenaeus, and Aelian, were also big readers of Greek classics, especially Plato. You'd think if there was a buzz about a first sophistic, one of them would have picked it up. But nope. Diogenes, in his Lives of Philosophers, basically says sophists were just clever talkers or traveling teachers spread across the entire history of Greek thought. No special era for them. Athenaeus, whose book is called Dinner Sophists, ironically uses the word sophist sarcastically when characters interrupt each other. And his 7 wise men. Turns out they're chefs. Alien mostly talks about Indian sages encountered by Alexander. So, while they knew the individual sophists, none of them seemed to have grasped or promoted the idea of a distinct, unified first sophistic movement. The concept seems to have been dormant until Philostratus gave it life. Now let's shift gears to Cicero, writing a bit earlier in Rome. Cicero, obsessed with rhetoric, definitely saw the sophists as important figures in the history of oratory. In his work Brutus, he outlines a history of Greek speaking in 4 stages. Stage 3 features the rise of the magistri discendi, the masters of speech, and guess who's on that list? Gorgias, Thrasymachus, Protagoras, Prodicus, Hippias. These guys, Cicero says, taught how to make a weak case strong through speaking. Then comes Socrates, who apparently messed things up, leading to stage 4, the age of Isocrates and Demosthenes, Cicero's heroes. Later, in On the Orator, a character named Catullus praises the idea that good orators need broad knowledge, and he lists Hippias, Prodicus, Thrasymachus, Protagoras, and Gorgias as prime examples. Notice something? He's basically saying, look, Plato, these guys were amazing speakers even if you didn't like their methods. This positive spin on their rhetorical skills, especially their ability to speak extemporaneously, is remarkably close to what Philostratus would do centuries later. Could there be a direct line of influence here? Given Philostratus knew Cicero's works, it's certainly possible. Then we have Dio of Prusa, another figure from the later sophistic whom Philostratus discusses. Dio actually gives us a glimpse of a first sophistic, but with a twist. In his short oration 54 dedicated to Socrates, Dio lists Hippias, Prodicus, Polus, and Gorgias. What does he say about them? That they were sophists who charged admission for their performances. He contrasts them sharply with Socrates, who, unlike them, amassed wealth in spirit, not in money, and whose words endured because his followers preserved them. The sophists? Their performances were fleeting, their words lost. So Dio uses the ancient sophists as a foil, just like Plato, to elevate Socrates. He identifies a common trait, money-making for shows, and pits it against Socrates' spiritual legacy. It's a negative portrayal, focused on contrast, unlike the more positive, integrated view Philostratus would later construct. Enter Lucian, the witty satirist. He's probably a sophist himself, though he's not on Philostratus' list. Lucian loves poking fun at philosophers and intellectuals. In one piece, Herodotus, he lists Hippias, Prodicus, Polus, and Anaximenes as ancient sophists who found fame quickly by performing at the Olympics, a shortcut compared to slow travel. Notice the overlap again, especially with Polus. And the setting, the Olympics, mirrors Philostratus's emphasis on public performance. In another, the mistaken critic, a speaker, introduced only as a sophist claiming to be such, delivers a prologue at Olympia, complaining about modern orators who pretend to be spontaneous. This speaker is clearly modeled on a classical traveling sophist, like Hippias. Lucian uses humor here, comparing ancient and modern types, highlighting the performance aspect, maybe even playfully adopting the title himself, while sidestepping its usual negative baggage. He shows awareness of the classical model and the importance of appearing spontaneous, themes Philostratus would later elaborate. What about the philosophical side? Generally, philosophers followed Aristotle's line, sophistry equals deception, fallacies. Sextus Empiricus, writing against the professors, discusses several sophists like Protagoras and Gorgias in the context of skepticism, or Prodicus among atheists. He examines Protagoras' famous relativism. He even mentions Isocrates regarding rhetoric. But notice, Sextus doesn't frame this as a specific sophistic age. He's grouping thinkers by ideas, not by historical period. Diogenes Laertius in his Lives calls Protagoras a sophist because he taught for pay. He notes Protagoras used Socratic forms of argument, blurring the line with Plato's rival. Diogenes focuses on their linguistic skills, sometimes calling them sophistries in the sense of clever tricks. While he lists figures Plato refuted, he never refers to them collectively as the sophists. So, the philosophical tradition, while discussing the individuals, largely avoids the historical framing and the positive spin that Philostratus provides. So, how does Philostratus actually build his case within the Lives of the Sophists? It's quite structured. About 10% of the book is dedicated to the first sophistic. It starts with a narrative frame. A rivalry between Gorgias and Prodicus marks the beginning, and a rivalry between Aeschines and Demosthenes marks the end. Then comes the main body, detailed biographical sketches of those 9 key figures we discussed. After this section, The book seamlessly transitions into the much longer biographies of the 42 members of the Second Sophistic. Before diving into the main list, Philostratus includes a preamble listing 8 other men active after the First Sophistic period, including Plato's students and Dio of Prusa. Why? Because even though he's trying to rehabilitate the Sophists, he acknowledges the lingering power of Plato's image, noting that even philosophers seemed like Sophists because they spoke well. It's a subtle nod to the ongoing debate. Philostratus himself uses the term ancient sophistic to describe this first phase. It stretches from Gorgias right up to Demosthenes or his teacher Socrates. What defines this practice? Public speaking, yes, but crucially, extemporaneous speech on common topics. And here's the kicker, he calls it philosophizing oratory. Now, hold on. From our perspective, orators and philosophers were different beasts. But Philostratus insists this ancient sophistic was a form of rhetoric that engaged with philosophy. This emphasis on the philosophical dimension is quite striking, and seems to be a deliberate counterpoint to the purely rhetorical or deceptive views held by some. He's weaving together threads from various classical texts, and perhaps even lost Hellenistic sources to create this unique picture. So, wrapping up, Philostratus' achievement is monumental. He didn't just list names, he constructed the first comprehensive narrative of a first sophistic era. He drew on earlier hints from Cicero, Dio, Lucian, and even philosophical discussions, but he synthesized them into a coherent, positive story. He celebrated the Sophists' rhetorical genius, their civic roles, and even framed their oratory as philosophical, directly pushing back against Plato's legacy. His vision became the standard, shaping how both ancient and modern audiences understood these fascinating figures. That's the power of writing the history.